Hello and welcome to NDTV. So, space travel has been a hot topic across the globe, and commercialization of space, especially, has been a very crucial topic being discussed across the globe, especially in US and in India, especially the collaboration between US and India in the field of space. So, to discuss this, we have with us Jacob Gullish, the Executive Director of the US India Business Council, joining us today. Thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us.
It's wonderful to be here. Space is a passion of mine, so it's a pleasure to talk with you about this topic.
So to begin with, could you explain to us a little bit about the collaboration between the public and private sector within the avenue of space, given the advancement we're seeing in the commercialization of space and space travel? And how do you think this is now going to impact this growing market of space exploration, space travel?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I'm talking to you from Bangalore, and I've been involved in India's space industry for many years now, more than a decade actually, and I've never quite seen so much vibrancy and energy as I do now. There's at the top line, there's been a change in, I think, Indian policy. It started with a new space policy. There were some changes in FDI rules, some discussions around some of the more technical facets of how to get a license and spectrum. But at the core, there's a tremendous passion amongst Indians to use this sector as a way to, utilize their talent. There's a new trend line here in India, and it has to do with commercial space. Traditionally, space has been things that governments do, and commercial space, is something that is changing. And in that sense, in the United States, in the early 80s, there was a movement to utilize commercial space capacity, originally in imaging, and that moved to SATCOM and to other sectors. India is experiencing the same kind of rapid movement to utilizing both commercial and government space. And in a US-India relationship, which has so many synergies in other sectors, I think there's a lot of opportunities to transcend commercial space within a US-India framework. Governments see that industry can bring capital and talent and new ideas and innovation that they sometimes struggle to do internally. And using a public-private partnership or other forms of contracts or commercial space arrangements really allows both stakeholders to benefit from each other.
Right. So what do you think are some of the opportunities for both India and the US to collaborate in the field of SATCOM space? Could you talk to us a little bit about what SATCOM is, and especially now, given the launch of India's new space policy, where do you think collaboration between these two countries is headed?
Yeah. Well, SATCOM really is the largest segment within the commercial space industry. We all sort of know it as direct-to-home broadcasting, or telephone companies use it to connect just normal calls, but it has a wide variety of applications. As a rule of thumb, it actually accounts for about 60% of the commercial space industry, and whether that be satellites, SATCOM satellites, or launch, or the services. And therefore, having a vibrant satellite communication sector really is additive to all the other segments in commercial space, whether that's infrastructure, as I mentioned, satellites, the constructions, or the teleports, or even sort of the facilities that allow governments to do space exploration. So getting the SATCOM piece right is really mission critical, and India's moved in that direction. They've made a lot of changes in the policy that enable SATCOM, including things like, as I mentioned, spectrum and access to capital. And then, of course, it's the end user that's going to drive the marketplace. And India has a massive market that could potentially benefit from satellite communications. The SATCOM segment itself is changing. It's changing bands. It's changing the types of services. Costs are dropping as well. And so it's really a high time, or really a perfect time for India to be opening its SATCOM sector, because the industry is changing. And I think India can be very competitive going forward. Those benefits in the SATCOM industry will benefit government in areas of Earth observation and launch and things of that nature. But again, it attracts a lot of capital, innovation, and technology in its own right that can be utilized elsewhere in your commercial space enterprise.
Right. So within this collaboration between India and the US, how do you aim to bridge the gap, the gender gap, and have more women empower women to take up more technology, become a larger part of the space sector?
Well, gender diversity and diversity overall is critical. Different people have different objectives and ways of thinking about things. It increases public support, and ultimately that increases mission success. India actually has a long history of having women in the space sector. One of my personal heroes is Kalpana Chawla, right? And so, she's a perfect example of the possibilities, boy or girl, and what you can do in the space sector. But there are others, of course. There's Ritu Srivastava, right? She's not the father, the mother rather, of a lot of rocketry in India, and I think a hero to a lot of young girls and boys as well. We're really actually pleased, as part of the reason I'm here in Bangalore. We actually have a number of American officials that are coming to Bangalore, and many of them are women, and we'll be talking about opportunities for women to have a greater role in technology and commercial space.
Right. So my last question to you is, where do you think this collaboration between India and the US is headed?
Yeah.
You see more opportunities for the two countries to collaborate in the commercialization of space?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The United States and India have been working on space for a very long time. Granted, much of that has been in the civilian arena. You could point to the NISAR mission, for example. A lot of this is framed under what's called the Joint Civil Space Working Group. And the two governments have come together, and they've been talking for many years on civil space issues, physics, and going to the moon and to Mars and things like that. What's new is that in recent times, in 2022, the Prime Minister and President Biden, they announced something called the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies. That initiative, in turn, was crystallized in January of 2023. And one of the real announcements there was that a commercial space working group would be added to the space dialogue. And what that enabled, I think, is the building of trust between the two countries. And so both governments now have a mechanism to talk commercial space. Now, really, as we started talking about partnerships in the beginning, this is ultimately business capitalists and end users, and how they innovate and use the service that we all need together. And so, but having a trusted framework at the top allows businesses to figure out some of the friction points, whether that's export controls or procurement, or frankly, just the basic trust that you can go ahead and do deal making. And as we also started, there's so much excitement here in Bangalore and elsewhere in India with startup communities and small satellites, and you're starting to see a lot of actual business happen. Partners and vendors and ideas coming together, movements of goods and services, and frankly, capital as well. And so we're really on an interesting trajectory. And at the core is this commercial space working group, which really, I think, provides the guardrails and the trust for industry on both sides to agree and move forward and work together.
Right. And lastly, you mentioned that you're in Bangalore to have these discussions as part of the US-India Business Council's event in Bangalore to discuss space commercialization and how Indian startups can work together with the US in this sector. So could you talk to us a little bit about what your key takeaways are going to be in this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, business at its core is people, right? You have to meet people. You have to have the right products and services that come together and the right platforms. And that's where these sorts of conferences are critical. We're really pleased that we have high-level participation from both governments. And then we've set up, a series of conversations that look at the various segments within commercial space, things like satellite communications, situational awareness, geospatial. And in that, we'll probably have several hundred people. They'll come together, businessmen and women. They'll talk about their products and services and ideas. They'll meet. They'll see if there's opportunities for partnerships and commerce and trade. And so the real takeaway is to understand what the overall global market is, to understand what the Indian market is, but also understand what these individual solutions are and how Indian and American companies can work together. One of the highlights of the conversation was that we worked with the US government on bringing a number of Indian startups into the United States to understand our commercial space sector, our experience, our history, our pitfalls and efficiencies. And we're really looking forward to hearing from them to understand their learnings from the US experience and how they may apply to India's commercial space endeavors.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us. I think you brought up some very interesting points about what this relationship between India and the US within this space sector can look like in the future, and what opportunities lie for Indian startups to collaborate with the US. So thank you so much for joining us at NDTV today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.